A routine landing.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting our approach to
Very good shape.
Turns into a sudden fight to the death.
You're gonna lose it all of a sudden. There it is.
A passenger jet mysteriously falls from the sky and rockets towards a busy highway.
Push it up. Push it way up.
Delta, go around. It's gonna crash.
A mysterious force brings down a plane claiming 137 lives. In the wreckage lies the one clue that can stop it from killing again. August the 2nd, 1985. Dallas, Texas. It's a very hot day, even by Texas standards.
See y'all tomorrow.
Temperatures soar to 101 degrees.
Rain coming. Should cool things down a bit.
In the late afternoon, William Maybury is heading home from work. The day's heat and humidity are having an effect on traffic at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, DFW. Roughly the size of Manhattan, DFW is the biggest airport in the world. It's also one of the busiest. The heat has triggered some afternoon thunderstorms at the airport, creating a backlog of planes waiting to take off.
American 631, you are cleared for takeoff.
Air traffic controller Gene Skipworth is in the tower today. He's been working there for 14 years. With him is controller Mike Porter.
Skipworth was not asking for help. Nothing seemed unusual other than the fact that we were starting to get busy and aircraft were starting to pile up.
One of the many planes heading towards Skipworth's control is Delta Airlines Flight 191.
Weather 6,000 scattered to 1,000 scattered. Visibility 10, temperature 101, wind calm.
101?
101 degrees, yes, sir.
Captain Ed Connors and First Officer Rudy Price are two of Delta Airlines' most experienced pilots. Second Officer Nick Nassick is the other member of today's crew. The crew is flying a 6-year-old L-1011 Tristar. The L-1011 is billed as one of the safest planes in the sky. There are 152 passengers and 11 crew members on board. They're scheduled to land in Dallas just before 6 in the evening.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. Hope you're enjoying your flight so far. Traffic is backing up at Dallas. All told, we'll be about 10 to 15 minutes late getting to the gate. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable.
The delay bothers Chris Meyer. He's a frequent business traveler who's in a hurry to get home to his family for the weekend.
I've been down in Florida, Fort Lauderdale, for the last 2 weeks, and it was a Friday afternoon, and I was due to go home on Flight 191.
One of IBM's best-known executives is also on the flight. Don Estridge led the development of the IBM PC. He and his wife are traveling to Dallas for a family visit.
(963), turn right, heading 620.
En route from Florida to Texas, Delta 191 will be in communication with several controllers.
I'll turn you into Blue Ridge. It'll be about 0.
Every aircraft is guided along its flight path by a series of regional air route traffic control centers. They direct each plane's speed and altitude.
1901, descend and maintain 10,000. Join the Blue Ridge 010 radial and inbound. We have a good area there to go through.
Captain Connors has some concerns about the route he's been given. He sees a storm cell along that path, and he doesn't want to fly through it.
Well, I'm looking at a cell at about a heading of 255. It's a pretty good-sized cell, and I'd rather not go through it. I'd rather go around it one way or the other.
I've had about 60 aircraft go through this area out here, 10 to 12 miles wide. They're getting a good ride, no problem.
Well, I can see a cell now about heading 240.
When I can, I'll turn you into Blue Ridge. It'll be about the 010 radial.
010, roger. We're going to hold you to that.
Captain Connors gets his way. He's given permission to fly around the storm. Once past it, he'll line up for a landing on runway 17 left.
I'm glad we didn't have to go through that.
Friday afternoons are a busy time at airports. The afternoon rain is making this Friday even busier.
23-9er down to 618.96.
The main priority for the controller on duty is to keep the incoming planes a safe distance apart. He wants them at least 4.5 kilometers from each other. That distance allows enough time for the violent air turbulence behind one plane to die down before the next plane touches down. Right now, Connors and Price are getting too close to the plane just ahead of them, a corporate Learjet.
Delta 191 heavy. Turn left 10 degrees, reduce speed to 180.
To put some distance between the two planes, the controller asks the Delta crew to slow to 180 knots.
Delta 191.
330 kilometers an hour.
Wilco.
10-degree flaps, please.
You're listening to Dallas 105 FM. It's a wet one out there, folks, so drive careful.
Heading home along Highway 114, William Maybury will soon be passing DFW. Flight 191 is now just 50 kilometers from the foot of the runway.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting our approach to DFW. Please make sure your seats are in the upright position and your seatbelts are securely fastened.
The crew begins their final descent into the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Attention all aircraft listening. There's a little rain shower just north of the airport.
Connors now switches radio frequencies and contacts a local DFW airport traffic controller for approach instructions. As the passengers and crew of Flight 191 prepare for their landing, a deadly force takes shape in their path. Critical decisions and missed information conspire against them. The crew will soon be engaged in a 47-second struggle, which will become one of the most important moments in the history of modern aviation. August the 2nd, 1985. The crew of Delta Airlines Flight 191 has been skirting a line of heavy storms between Florida and their destination, Texas. 30 kilometers from the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, First Officer Rudy Price notices rain ahead.
We're gonna get our airplane washed.
What?
We're gonna get our airplane washed.
It seemed like the closer we got into DFW, the worse the weather got. And we was turning it into the rain instead of going around it. And the pilots never said anything about the bad weather.
Delta 191 is still closing in on the Learjet ahead of it. Price and Connors need to slow down even further to put some distance between the two planes.
Delta 191 heavy, reduce speed to 150.
Speed to 150.
9 kilometers from runway 17 left, Delta 191 is handed over to another controller, Gene Skipworth, for final approach and landing.
090 Tower, Delta 191 Heavy, out here in the rain. Feels good.
Delta 191
Skipworth tells the crew to expect a manageable crosswind of up to 15 knots.
Winds 090 at 5, gusts to 15.
Thank you, sir.
First Officer Price will be at the controls for the upcoming landing. Pilots and co-pilots routinely alternate flying duties. As Flight 191 is coming into land, William Maybury is just north of the airport. He's caught in the same storm that Price and Connors are just beginning to fly through.
Before landing check.
Landing gear.
Down, 3 green.
Flaps, slats.
33, 33, green lights.
The crew suddenly notices that they'll be flying into more than a bit of rain.
There's lightning coming out of that one.
What?
There's lightning coming out of that one.
Where?
Right ahead of us.
1,000 feet. I'll call them out to you.
All right.
We're not getting any bad warnings from the weather or from other pilots, which we rely on as they come through it. They need to report to us, and they do if they have turbulence or they have trouble on final or ran into anything abnormal.
The Learjet ahead of Flight 191 lands safely. Connors and Price are now less than a minute behind. Without warning, the intensity of the storm increases. The L-1011 is being pounded by a driving rain.
I knew we was getting ready to land, but at the same time, you felt the surge, like the pilot was revving up the engine for something.
The plane's airspeed is increasing for no apparent reason.
What's your speed?
Price pulls back on the throttles to slow the plane down and maintain it at the requested 150 knots. The plane is just 180 meters from the ground.
You're gonna lose it all of a sudden. There it is.
Then the plane drops rapidly. It's as though an invisible force is pushing it to the ground.
Push it up. Push it way up. Way up!
Way up!
Way up!
The crew is pushing the plane's jet engines to their full power, but can't get more speed or get the plane to climb.
So I pulled my seatbelt tight as I could, but at the same time, you could hear a pin drop. Nobody was talking. But I mean, it got dead silence.
As suddenly as it began, the crisis seems to end. The plane stops falling and begins to pick up some of the speed Connors and Price have been fighting for.
That's it.
But before the crew can take another breath, the plane drops again, rocking violently from side to side. And then it dips wildly to the right.
And I just knew we shouldn't be that close to the ground that soon.
Hang on to the son of a...
About 2 kilometers from the runway, it plows into a field and rockets towards Highway 114.
When we hit the ground, it felt like you was in a car running over railroad ties. It was real bumpy.
The crew somehow manages to get the plane back in the air. At that moment, Gene Skipworth catches sight of Delta 191.
He's gonna crash! Delta, go around!
But it's too late. The plane's engines slam into William Maybury's car on Highway 114. He is killed instantly. The plane hits the ground again, north of the runway. It's traveling more than 350 kilometers an hour.
I must have caught sight of him just at the last millisecond, and he cartwheeled into the tank in just an instant, and then, of course, there was fire, not a ball of fire, but a wall of fire.
It seemed like it was only a few seconds, 5 seconds at the most. I don't know how long it was. Everything was stopped.
The resulting explosion is so powerful that the rear section of the plane is blasted backwards, away from the fireball.
Then all of a sudden you look up and it's just nothing there. Everything's gone. You just see the whole big picture outside. Like the plane just opened up.
Remarkably, the tail section containing the last 10 rows of seats is relatively intact.
People just thrown around on the ground. Some were clothes on, some without clothes on, some were burned. It was something that you can't describe unless you're there to see it. It is something that you will never get out of your mind.
Help! Over here! Hang in there, help's on the way.
Then, as suddenly as it had started, the rain stops. It takes firefighters less than a minute to get to the crash.
And when I arrived on the scene, I truly believed that there wasn't anybody that had survived this plane crash because there was just devastation everywhere. What I had pulled up on at the time was the wing section, which is the portion of the aircraft that carries the fuel. So there was a large amount of fuel and a large amount of flames.
The front of the plane has all but disintegrated.
I knew I had to get out there. At the time, I was a stringer for Time magazine, worked with them on a part-time basis, called their Atlanta headquarters for this portion of the country. They said one word, go.
Firefighters need only a few minutes to get the raging fire under control. They then turn their attention to pulling survivors from the plane.
It wasn't until the fire started to subside a little bit that I saw the tail section where there was some hope of some people surviving. There were these two women that were walking through the smoke.
Ladies, clear the area! Get out of the way, clear the area!
And it kind of surprised me, so I knew that there was hope and that there were people out there.
Only 27 people survived the crash.
I had seen death before as a medic in Vietnam, but it had never been aimed at civilians, and certainly not on a mass casualty situation, and certainly not this suddenly. I could tell how bad it was. You could see and smell and feel the death.
We felt like we did everything that we could, and we were just pleased that there were survivors.
I was scheduled to sit on aisle seat 15A, and I told them that wouldn't be no good because that was a non-smoking section. I was a smoker, so I had to be in back. That probably saved my life.
Captain Connors, First Officer Price, and Second Officer Nassick are killed. So are 5 other crew members and 128 passengers. IBM's Don Estridge and his wife are among the dead.
In the tower, there was silence for probably 1 to 2 minutes, except for just an occasional transmission. But basically, it's just quiet, and you just sit there stunned and wishing you could do anything to take it back.
This is a monumental crash. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrive at DFW, determined to find the cause.
One of our field investigators would have been on scene trying to locate the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, which is, you know, a very important part of the investigation.
Investigators begin looking for evidence of mechanical failure. They examine the wreckage for clues that the plane was not responding to the pilot's command.
It's essential in any approach or departure accident to establish what the airplane's configuration was, to assure that it was not a factor in the accident, where everything was normal on this aircraft.
Investigators turn their attention away from the plane and to the skies.
After any accident in commercial aviation, there are theories galore. A couple of them prevalent that evening. First, that lightning had struck the airplane. Secondly, that it had been hit by a mini tornado.
There's lightning coming out of that one.
Where?
Right ahead of us.
15 different witnesses, including flight crews, report seeing lightning as Flight 191 was descending towards the runway. The investigators have to consider the possibility that Flight 191 was hit by lightning.
Lightning is always something that you have to investigate to determine the possibility that lightning disabled some part of the airplane.
In 1963, a Boeing 707 was struck by lightning. The lightning ignited the fuel in the plane's tank. The plane crashed. 81 people died. There had been a handful of similar crashes since then. Key pieces of wreckage from Flight 191 are taken to the NTSB lab in Washington, D.C. Bud Lehner is the investigator in charge of examining the wreckage, as well as the data from the plane's cockpit voice recorder.
But sometimes it might be very difficult to find to determine where the airplane might have been struck by lightning and where the exit point was.
Lightning coming out of that one.
Where?
Right ahead of us.
If the plane was hit by lightning, there would be evidence left behind. A device called a static discharge wick is attached to the trailing edge of an airplane's wings. It redirects static electricity into the outside air instead of into the plane, where the charge could cause a fire. If the plane was hit by lightning, one of the pieces that would be visibly damaged is the static discharge wick.
Nothing there.
With lightning ruled out, investigators go looking elsewhere. They would soon discover the real culprit. It had actually been caught on tape. A Delta Airlines L-1011 crashes after entering a storm near Dallas. "137 people die. Investigators rule out mechanical problems and lightning as causes of the crash.
Nothing there.
The NTSB's Bud Lehner turns his attention to the plane just ahead of Delta 191, the corporate Learjet. He learns that it was less than a minute ahead and flew through the very same storm.
After we had passed about 5 miles from the end of the runway, we entered a rain shower, what we thought was a light rain shower, and it turned out to be the heaviest rain I've ever seen before or since.
In spite of the rain, Rufus Lewis managed to land his plane safely on runway 17 left.
When we broke out of the clouds, we were high and hot. So we had to use all of the runway at DFW Airport. We landed, were able to turn off at the end of the runway.
So why was the much larger L-1011 unable to land just moments later?
Delta 191 Heavy, reduce speed to 15.
To put some distance between Delta 191 and the Learjet, the controller had asked Price to slow his plane several times. When Lehner plots the bigger plane's speed,
then down to 150,
he finds that it was coming in to land at 150 knots.
Delta 191 Heavy, reduce speed to 150.
Investigators consider the possibility that Flight 191 had been traveling too slowly for a safe landing.
If you don't have a lot of extra energy, you don't have anything to trade in case you get in trouble. A lot of times in adverse conditions, the pilots, they add another 10 knots for mom and the kids.
Crews don't have to follow a controller's speed request if they think it's unsafe. Price did reduce his speed. He knew this plane extremely well. He had actually helped to rewrite the L-1011's operating manual.
If the captain decided that 150 knots was too slow, they would have told the controller it was too slow and they wouldn't have flown it.
Lehner consults the airplane's manufacturer and interviews other L-1011 pilots. He concludes that neither the controller nor First Officer Price made any errors regarding speed.
Delta 191 Heavy, reduce speed to 150.
This plane should have been able to land at 150 knots.
Speed to 150.
Bud Lehner still doesn't know what slammed Flight 191 into the ground. But soon he finds the clues he needs on the plane's flight data recorder. It logs every adjustment pilots make to the plane's controls. The device also records external elements like temperature, wind speed, altitude, and air pressure. Whatever Connors and Price were fighting, there's a good chance it left its fingerprints on the flight data recorder.
This flight data recorder gave us several parameters we didn't have before. Engine power, longitudinal acceleration, and those kinds of parameters really enabled us to do a more in-depth analysis.
The plane's data recorder has documented a combination of rapidly shifting winds.
Then it shifts to a downdraft.
In a matter of seconds, the plane was hit with strong winds from the front, then from above, and then from behind.
There you have it.
For Bud Lehner, that sequence could only mean one thing: a microburst. A microburst is a violent shaft of air falling from a storm cloud. Back in 1985, few people knew more about encounters between microbursts and airplanes than John McCarthy.
If you're at the kitchen sink and you turn on the water and it goes straight down and it splashes out in all directions. And that's kind of what a microburst is, except that it is extremely bad news if you're an airplane flying through it at low altitude.
A plane first faces a strong headwind which lifts the plane skyward, then a downdraft which slams it towards the ground. Finally, the microburst delivers its most dangerous punch, the tailwind.
And you would get a rapid descent, a loss of lift, and a rapid descent towards the ground, and easily crash the airplane.
A plane's wings need a steady flow of air moving over them. That's what gives them their lift. By inhibiting that flow, the tailwind reduces lift. There's no better recipe for a microburst than the weather conditions at Dallas-Fort Worth on the day of the crash. It had been extremely hot all day, and hot air rises. When that hot air meets the cold, moist air in the storm clouds, it cools instantly and rushes violently back to Earth. A microburst.
It is a tiny thing, meteorologically speaking, compared to a big storm or a snowstorm or a hurricane. It's just like a needle in a haystack. At its maximum strength, it's no more than 2 miles across, and it lasts no more than 15 minutes. So if you look at that little space and time window, it's very small. And so the probability of hitting one is low.
The odds may be slim, but planes do fly into microbursts. In 1975, an Eastern Airlines flight landing in New York flew into a microburst. It slammed the plane into the ground, killing 113 people. Then, in 1982, a microburst killed another 153 people when it struck a Pan Am 727, taking off from New Orleans. It was clear that 136 people on Flight 191 had become the latest victims of a microburst. Investigators had their culprit.
Unbelievable.
And thanks to Flight 191's advanced data recorder, they could paint a remarkably accurate picture of it. The killer had essentially been caught on tape. But what the flight data recorder doesn't explain is how such an experienced crew fell victim to a killer
You're in good shape.
they were all trained to overcome. When Lehner compares the pilot's actions to the actions of the microburst,
Watch your speed.
he uncovers details of a fight to the death. A fight that the Delta pilots almost won.
Lose it all of a sudden. There it is.
He seemed to know what he was going to hit.
Watch your speed.
The increase in airspeed prompted First Officer Price to reduce power to his engines. Power that he would desperately need in just a few seconds.
You're gonna lose it all of a sudden. There it is.
When Price and Connors entered the downdraft,
Push it up.
they were less than 250 meters from the ground.
The captain knew the characteristics of a microburst. He'd obviously been given an introduction to wind shear and microburst characteristics in his flight training.
When Connors and Price encountered the microburst's tailwind, there was very little they could do. They had insufficient speed and altitude with which to maneuver. If a pilot encounters a strong tailwind at 3,000 meters, he can point his nose down and dive to pick up speed and generate lift. It's called trading altitude for airspeed. But that trade wasn't available to Price and Connors. They were just 150 meters off the ground when the tailwind struck. The only way for them to gain airspeed was from their engines.
Push it up. Way up.
Co-pilot responds, the airplane stabilizes. I can see that most pilots would say, well, we're through with that, and rain's gonna stop, we're gonna land.
Momentarily, their efforts seem to pay off. Their airspeed increases, their plunge is halted. But with Flight 191 less than 150 meters from the ground, this particular microburst delivered the ultimate blow. A fierce crosswind that forces their plane to bank dangerously to the right. Combined with the microburst's other winds, the crew was defenseless.
Toga is takeoff go-around mode. And what it means to a pilot in that regime of flight is let's abandon the approach. We're no longer going to try to land this airplane. We want to do everything we can now to survive the wind condition that we've entered.
The skill and experience of the pilots were no match for this microburst. It was too big, its winds too powerful and unpredictable. The entire fight lasted only 47 seconds.
The pilots of Delta Flight 191 did their very best to recover from this situation, and it didn't work out.
Investigators were left with one perplexing question. Why had Connors flown into the storm in the first place?
Prior to 1985, the radars on board the aircraft were built to detect thunderstorms, essentially heavy areas of precipitation. They were not effective. They weren't not even designed to detect the microburst. So those radars were essentially useless at low altitudes for looking at the microburst phenomena.
Microbursts are invisible, but they generally emerge from storm clouds. That's why pilots are trained not to fly into storms if they see lightning.
It's a pretty good size cell, and I'd rather not go through it. I'd rather go around it one way or the other.
When I can, I'll turn you into Blue Ridge. It'll be about 010 radial.
010. Oh, roger.
Captain Connors was not a risk taker. He was known as a cautious pilot.
I'm glad we didn't have to go through that mess.
It's hard to blame the aircrew. Their job is to avoid thunderstorms, and there's probably a forecast for thunderstorms every day at Dallas in the summertime. Which ones do you avoid? And it's a very difficult problem.
Earlier in the flight, Connors had flown around bad weather. Investigators can only conclude that he underestimated the storm in his path at the foot of runway 17 left.
When you're in a landing sequence at an airport like Dallas or Atlanta or Chicago, and you see other airplanes ahead that are landing uneventfully, you might get the impression that there's a thunderstorm there, but I'm going to pass through it very quickly, and it's not going to be a factor for me.
Airports like DFW have sophisticated systems in place to provide weather information to pilots. A thunderstorm at the end of a runway is the kind of threat they were designed to identify. But this deadly storm managed to foil those systems. As Flight 191 was approaching the airport, the weather at DFW was changing very quickly.
Attention all aircraft listening. There's a little rain shower just north of the airport.
Captain Connors heard that part of the message, but then he switched his radio frequency for his final landing instructions. The Delta crew never heard the last part of this message about weather ahead.
There's a little bitty thunderstorm sitting right on the final.
There was an observation 2 minutes before the accident that there was a wall of water at the threshold of the runway. It's been my contention that that information would have been very important to the flight crew.
Radar readouts from the day of the crash indicate that the storm cell Connors and Price flew into grew out of nothing in a matter of minutes.
This is 2 minutes before the accident.
The readout shows the beginnings of a weather cell at the foot of runway 17 left.
This is 3 minutes after the accident. We have a new cell right at the threshold of the runway that wasn't evident in the previous pictures.
This explains why Rufus Lewis was able to land his Learjet. The microburst was just beginning to form when he was approaching the runway.
Many people think that there was a huge vertical development that the pilots recognized and they just decided to go fly through it anyway. And I maintain, and I think the evidence proves it, that that was not the case. They didn't recognize this new developing cell. They did get into the storm beneath the cell, but it was heavy rain. They weren't worried about that. Then the hammer fell. It was too late.
It's small. It's the length of a runway, roughly, and it doesn't last very long. So it's something that can happen so quickly that many accidents have occurred because nobody knew it was there.
The storm arrived at the foot of runway 17 left virtually unannounced. But once there, it attracted a lot of attention. Pilots on the ground, as well as trained weather observers, saw the worsening storm. But they all saw it too late to warn the crew of Delta 191. The storm did show up on a radar screen at the Fort Worth Air Traffic Control Center. But at the time of the crash, the meteorologist on duty was in the cafeteria on a meal break.
If the flight crew had had any idea that there would be a severe event in front of them, they would have missed the approach.
Investigators conclude that the Delta crash was caused by the pilot's decision to continue their approach into the storm. A decision that was made because the crew wasn't warned about the hazard. In 1985, there were basic systems at airports that could detect dangerous winds, but they could not reliably detect a microburst.
On the ground, there were systems called low-level wind shear alerting systems that primarily looked for differences of wind speed around the airport and on the airport. Unfortunately, these sensors tended to be spaced so far apart that a microburst could actually exist in between them and escape detection, or at least detection in time to warn a pilot of the threat.
But a microburst detection system to overcome this problem had been developed. It was being tested in Denver and working very well.
What we found out is that Doppler radar, which is on the ground, is incredibly effective in detecting microbursts. And in fact, it can detect about 98% of a microburst.
Conventional radar uses radio waves to measure precipitation inside a storm. Doppler also sends out radio waves, but by measuring the frequency of returning waves, Doppler can also calculate the movement of the winds inside a storm.
And if you look through the Doppler radar, you see a part of it that's going away from the radar and a part that's coming towards the radar. And if it's small, it's absolutely a microburst. It can be nothing else. So it has what we call an unambiguous signature of a microburst, which means we got it.
Since Doppler radar could see a microburst, controllers could use it to warn crews of their presence. The Denver research resulted in an important new system at airports: Terminal Doppler Weather Radar. When the system detects dangerous conditions, it relays a warning to air traffic controllers, who can then alert pilots.
Flight 236, microburst alert. 50 knot lock, 1 mile final, stay in tension.
After the crash of Delta 191, the Federal Aviation Authority, the FAA, hurried to install terminal Doppler weather radar at high-risk airports. Dallas-Fort Worth was one of the first. The domes containing the specialized radar are now a common fixture at major airports around the world. But radar on the ground can't get the warning to the pilots fast enough.
We also have an issue of ground-based systems in that it takes time to communicate the threat to the crew. The system has to detect it on the ground. It would typically go to a control position in the control tower and be relayed by voice to the pilot, which can introduce a delay of 10, 15, 20 seconds, which could be very critical.
Planes also needed onboard microburst detection. A team from NASA began developing such a system by flying into the most dangerous microbursts they could find.
Here we go. Take it. Straight ahead.
By risking their own lives, they would eventually save thousands of others. Delta Airlines Flight 191 is the latest in a string of crashes attributed to a microburst. Since 1964, microbursts were shown to be the cause of 26 accidents, claiming more than 500 lives. The public is unnerved. Politicians are demanding answers. The killer has to be stopped.
The body count is building, and this particular crash tipped the scales as far as the federal government was concerned.
The crash of Delta 191 showed that seconds count when planes encounter a microburst.
You're going to lose it all of a sudden. There it is.
Increasing alert times
Push it up. Way
could
up.
save more lives, especially if a microburst detector was mounted right on the plane.
If you can provide the airplane with 10, 15, 20 seconds of advance warning, pilots push the throttles up, they build airspeed, they build altitude, they build energy. It's like money in the bank. By the time they get to the microburst during a recovery, they can survive.
Aviation experts had to find a way to give all pilots those critical 20 seconds. To develop that technology, they would embark on a high-risk, unprecedented research project. They would fly a 737 into the most severe microbursts they could find.
We did a very careful risk analysis of all the possible dangers that could occur. And initially, the first reaction was, you want to do what with an airplane? You want to fly it through a microburst?
In the summer of 1991, NASA modified a Boeing 737 and went hunting for microbursts. The idea was to identify onboard technology that could warn pilots of a microburst in their path.
The airborne solution brings detection right into the cockpit, so the pilot sees exactly what's in front of the aircraft, and when an alert is given, there's no time delay.
Ground speed 234.
The NASA researchers were testing 3 separate systems for detecting microbursts. Modified Doppler radar housed in the 737's nose, a laser radar under its forward cargo bay, and a side-mounted infrared device to measure changes in air temperature. Each of those systems was wired to banks of computers in the plane's cabin. A spotter on the ground could find a microburst and quickly direct the plane towards it.
Roger, control 515. We're rolling.
Roger, understand your roll. TDWR and after control.
Range 45 miles. Ground speed 240. Here we go. Take it straight ahead.
Need to come left about 10 degrees, 15 degrees.
Well, when you spotted a microburst, it was all business. It was how do we get there, how do we get to the right altitude, the right airspeed, the right position, when to begin data collection. So people were quite busy during these flights. But yeah, it was exciting. We wanted to find them, we wanted to penetrate them.
With every microburst, the 3 onboard detection systems were put to the test. Researchers on the plane could instantly see which instrument was doing the best job of picking up the microburst ahead.
Behind the aft flight deck, we had pallets of equipment where the radar engineers, the laser engineers, the data recording engineers could sit and ensure that each system was performing as expected.
Ground speed 234. Dead ahead maybe 1 degree to the left.
Let's go straight through this one.
Here we go. Take it. Straight ahead.
We started with very, very weak microburst. Again, we had the ground-based radar telling us what we were about to go into. So we started with very weak microbursts, gained experience, then gradually worked up to stronger and stronger ones. You would see the rain begin to fall, and you would feel a sinking feeling. It'd be a little settling, you know, a little like an elevator starting down.
A few minutes here before we touch down. What do you see us now?
So any apprehension that the crew may have had initially about going through them was actually replaced later with joy at finding them.
Here comes the center of the target, right now. 242 on the ground speed. Wind's gone away. Look for a tailwind.
Watch.
Lost some altitude there, too. There, the wind's gone around the tail like 10 knots. Good strong downdraft in the middle of it. Just sucked 100 feet in almost no time at all.
Our good performance decreased, too.
We were about 850 and we dropped to 750. Beautiful.
The Langley researchers flew into dozens of microbursts over the course of their research. The project proved that the forward-looking Doppler radar was the only system that could consistently give pilots advanced warnings of a microburst ahead.
What we found was that the Doppler radars could detect an extremely wide variety of microbursts.
There's lightning coming out of that one.
If the crew of Delta 191 had a system to warn them of microbursts, they could have boosted power to their engines and started climbing before they encountered it. That might have given them the speed and the altitude which they sorely lacked when they began their battle with the storm. The Langley flight tests had, in effect, tamed the microburst menace. After the NASA tests, the FAA certified a Doppler-based warning system for planes. Today, forward-looking Doppler radar is standard equipment on commercial flights around the world.
The good news out of all of this tragedy is so many things have now happened, from radar to ground-based systems to airborne systems, and especially to training for pilots. We think that microburst accidents are a thing of the past.
If there is one crash that we can look back on now and say, this made things safer because we learned from it, it was Delta 191.
The changes made after the crash of Delta 191 have saved countless lives. Captain Connors and First Officer Price lost their fight against a microburst, but their struggle did manage to expose and disarm an invisible killer. A brand new 767.
Fuel pressure. Why would that be?
How come I have no instruments?
A catastrophic failure at 26,000 feet.
Winnipeg, Air Canada 143.
Air Canada 143, go ahead.
Just lost both engines.
Holy cow!
I'm talking to a dead man.
How far are we from Gimli?
You're approximately 12 miles from Gimli right now.
I guess I'll just slip it.
The crew is out of options and running out of time. They're at the controls of a 95-ton jet that's quickly falling from the sky.
Mayday, Mayday.
In placid skies over central Canada, Air Canada Flight 143 is just past the halfway mark of its journey from Montreal to Edmonton, Alberta.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your first officer.
The plane is carrying 61 passengers and 8 crew members.
Beautiful day. Clear, temperature of 24 degrees Celsius.
It's July the 23rd, 1983.
There, that's coming along, huh?
Rick Dion is an Air Canada maintenance engineer.
I was going to Edmonton with my wife Pearl and my young son Chris, who was 4 years old, and this was the beginning of a 2-week vacation for us, and we were all pretty excited about going on this new airplane.
Compliment of the captain.
Oh, hey, Rob, thanks.
Whenever you want to come up to the flight deck.
This was my first flight on the modern 767, as the company had just acquired them.
I'll be back in a minute, okay?
I was interested in going to the cockpit to see all this new technology fit in with the work that I did on aircraft.
The captain on this flight is Bob Pearson. He's 48 years old, and he's spent more than 15,000 hours in the air. His first officer is Maurice Quintel, who has more than 7,000 hours of flying time.
Come on in.
Pardon me, gentlemen?
Rick.
I knew Bob Pearson from the small flying club that I attended in St. Lazare, and he was actually one of the local pilots there that used to do some gliding, and he also flew the ultralight lasers.
We had departed heading northwest, a nice clear sunny day in July. We're flight plan at 39,000 feet. There were a few airplanes that flew that high in 1983. And we requested 41,000 feet, which got us further above the jet stream out of the west.
The crew may have accumulated a lot of hours in the air, but very few in this plane. It's Boeing's latest and most advanced wide-body jet, the 767. An army of microprocessors in the belly of the plane automates so many functions that the flight engineer's job has been eliminated. This is one of 4 767s that Air Canada has recently acquired. The plane itself has only 150 hours on it.
Quite a difference here, huh?
Oh, yeah.
Reset on and start here.
The cockpit is different in that all the old instrumentation that we're accustomed to, mostly that was all gone. It was all CRT display, like small TV screens. It was a new high-tech airplane, which involved quite a change for the crew and the maintenance personnel, people handling it.
This is a new aircraft for both the captain and I. At the time, I had 75 hours on that airplane, so everything was new for me.
Pilots and maintenance crews are both still getting to know this airliner.
Well, then we get that same condition.
Captain Pearson explains to Dion how he handled a small problem with the engines on an earlier flight.
Comes back down to low stage, and we just carry on.
You know, that brings up an interesting...
Fuel pressure. Why would that be?
Whoa.
A warning alerts the crew to critically low pressure at one of the plane's fuel pumps.
Something's wrong with the fuel pump.
The 767 has 3 main fuel tanks, 2 in the wings, which are always used, and 1 in the center, only used on long-distance flights. Electric fuel pumps draw fuel from each tank and feed it to the plane's 2 engines. The low-pressure warning could mean that one of the pumps needs maintenance, but it could also be a more serious issue, a lack of fuel to be pumped.
That forward fuel pump. It's just a bloody pump failing, I can tell you that.
Another low fuel pressure warning sounds, this one from another fuel pump on the plane's left side. Pearson's flight management computer tells him he should have plenty of fuel for the remainder of the trip. The 767 also has separate digital fuel gauges, but on this flight those gauges are out of service. The warnings don't make sense.
It got a little more interesting when the second fuel boost pump light came on for that tank, which was the left tank.
This seemed quite abnormal, that 2 pumps would fail in a brand new airplane. We had some kind of a problem that we didn't understand.
What would your assessment of that be? My own personal thoughts? It might be low in the left tank.
I used to be involved with transferring fuel, and I know that when you're trying to empty a tank, it'll start flashing periodically, and then the pump will reprime, and then the light will go out. In this case, it appeared to do exactly the same thing.
Captain Pearson knows that if the left tank is running low, the right tank may be low as well.
Let's head for Winnipeg. Now.
Pearson wants to land as soon as possible in case he is running out of fuel. The crew is still more than 700 miles away from their original destination, Edmonton, Alberta. The nearest major airport is Winnipeg, Manitoba, a mere 120 miles away.
We're showing lots of fuel on board our flight management computer and 3 normal fuel checks, cross-checked with our fuel on our flight plan. So we elected to divert the flight to Winnipeg, where Air Canada has a main maintenance base.
Winnipeg Center, Air Canada 143.
Air Canada 143, go ahead.
Ron Hewitt has 20 years' experience as a radar controller.
Yes, sir, we have a problem. We're going to requesting direct Winnipeg.
Air Canada 143 cleared. Take position, direct Winnipeg.
You are cleared to maintain 6,000, descent, your discretion.
Send to 6,000 his discretion, and that was it. He didn't tell us what the problem was, and it's none of my business. Give him what he wants, get everybody out of his way. That's about what we do.
Okay, we're out of 410.
Pearson now begins to descend from 41,000 feet.
Oh, man. We're all going out, eh?
The low-pressure warnings are spreading to more and more of the fuel pumps. Quintel instructs the cabin crew to prepare for an emergency landing.
Hello?
Cabin, we think we have problems with our fuel system.
We are diverting to Winnipeg.
All flight attendants to front galley, please.
I hope this is just false warnings. Rick, can you think of anything we haven't done?
No, I can't, Bob.
Okay. We've lost the left engine.
Losing an engine erases any doubt. Flight 143 is in fact running out of fuel.
Okay, checklist. Single engine landing.
Pearson is trained to land a 767 with 1 engine. No one has ever tried landing with none. He scrambles to get his plane down so that he doesn't become the first. With only 1 engine powering Air Canada Flight 143, and with the possibility of the other engine shutting down, the crew prepares the passengers for the worst.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your in-charge flight attendant speaking. Due to mechanical problems, we'll be preparing for an emergency landing. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts. Your crew is fully trained to deal with the situation, and as you may have noticed, some crew members have already started to prepare the aircraft.
I had no idea, like the rest of my crew members, that there was a problem with fuel. I had no idea why we were going to Winnipeg.
Approach and landing. Flaps will be 20.
Right.
Ground flap override.
As they're doing that drill, the right-hand fuel pump low pressure light was flashing as well, much like it did on the left. They were quite busy carrying out the first engine out, not watching the pump lights, which was right at my eyebrow, so I kind of knew that that one there was going to shut down too.
What was that?
Very shortly, we will begin giving you instructions.
How come I have no instruments?
Our beautiful colored engine and flight instrument displays simply went black.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. Please follow our instructions. Refrain from smoking and put your chair back in the upright position. Secure your seatbelt tightly against your hip.
It's exactly what Pearson had feared. He's lost both engines. At 26,500 feet, still 75 miles from the nearest major airport, he's out of fuel.
Winnipeg, Air Canada 143.
Air Canada 143, go ahead.
Just lost both engines.
When both engines shut off, I think he said, "Holy, I'm talking to a dead man."
We were trained in the simulator to handle a single engine failure. We had never practiced, and I don't believe most pilots ever get the chance to practice total engine failures.
143 just lost their engines.
It's highly unlikely that anybody's going to survive this, because I could see them trying to make a turn and spinning in.
An airplane's engines not only provide thrust, they also generate the power needed to manipulate the plane. It would be completely uncontrollable, but modern airliners are like a Swiss Army knife with one last blade hidden away. In the event of a loss of power, they automatically deploy the RAT, or ram air turbine.
It's spring-loaded, and the propeller that drives this small hydraulic pump is about the size of a propeller you would see like on a little Cessna 150. And this arm catapults down into the slipstream. This propeller starts to turn, drives this hydraulic pump, and it gives you basic systems.
I was pretty quiet, flying without motors.
Pearson knows that time is running out. He needs directions to the closest landing strip.
143, this is a Mayday, and we require a vector arm to the closest available runway.
143, we copied that all okay.
But the loss of the plane's engines has had an unexpected consequence at air traffic control.
They're gone. They were right here. We've lost him. He's dropped off the screen. I need primary radar.
Uh, 143, we've lost your transponder return and are attempting to pick up your target now.
We work on transponder, it's called secondary radar. We take the pilot signal to paint the aircraft.
Commercial jetliners are equipped with a transponder, a device that transmits coded information which air traffic controllers use to determine the plane's location. But when Flight 143 lost its second engine, only a small number of items got backup power. The transponder was not one of them, so the plane disappeared from Hewitt's screen. Flight 143 is somewhere east of Winnipeg, but no one knows exactly where or how far it is from the airport. In spite of its enormous weight, a 767 doesn't plunge from the sky when it loses its engines. Its aerodynamic properties keep it in the air, but slowly coasting to Earth.
And I was trying to figure how many miles we were moving ahead versus how many thousands of feet we were dropping.
But Quintel doesn't have the instruments which provide the information he needs to make that calculation. Since he lost the plane's signal, Hewitt can't give Quintel that information either. Controllers hurriedly work to rig up a way to find the plane.
Just before landing, you will hear the command, brace for landing. Brace immediately and stay braced until the plane comes to a complete stop. There are 2 ways to brace. 1, bend forward. Raise your arms and hands against the seat back.
Bryce Bell is a businessman on his way home to Edmonton.
As soon as they announced that we were making an unscheduled stop in Winnipeg, I immediately wished I hadn't had the 2 drinks that I'd had, because I thought, you're going to have a split second here, and this plane's going to explode in flame, and the decision you make in that split second will depend on how alert you are.
Okay, please put your personal belongings in the seat back pocket.
The response of the passengers when we were doing the emergency briefing was basically alert. They were looking at us. They were paying attention to every word we were saying. I couldn't have had better passengers.
I think that's him. Let's say that's him.
Because their modern equipment can't see Air Canada 143, the controllers switch to old-fashioned radar, which doesn't need a transponder to locate planes.
I got to turn up my true radar, the reflective radar, which is not nearly as good. And we don't use it at all if we can help it.
Okay, I got it. 65 from Winnipeg, 45 from Gimli. 143.
We have you at 65 miles from Winnipeg and approximately 45 miles from Gimli.
For the first time since losing power, the pilots know their distance to Winnipeg.
We might make Winnipeg.
Quintel, however, thinks that Gimli is a safer bet. Gimli, Manitoba has a decommissioned Air Force base. It's about 20 miles closer than Winnipeg. As luck would have it, Maurice Quintel trained at Gimli while in the armed forces. He knows it well.
45 miles to Gimli. That is a long runway.
Is there emergency equipment at Gimli?
Negative emergency equipment at all. Just 1 runway available, I believe.
And no control tower and no information on it.
Pearson must consider the possibility of a crash landing. If he has any chance of making it to Winnipeg, which has full emergency support, he knows he must try for it.
Okay, then we would prefer Winnipeg.
Fine. 143, continue your present heading.
We all reacted very businesslike and say something specifically to the situation, but never would we ever look at each other. I think we were all afraid that we might break down.
Parents were hugging their little kids, and people were busy scribbling away, which I found out afterwards where they were writing their notes to loved ones and their wills and all kinds of things like that. It was pretty nerve-wracking.
143, a question if you have the time.
Okay, go ahead.
Total number of persons on board, please.
The actual number of people on board is 69, but Quintel is overtaxed. He gives a lower number in error.
I have 33 people on board,
including the crew.
Okay.
I have to ask if Soul's on board. I know he's busy. I don't want to ask him questions, but I have to. This thing can go down in the lake or the field. And I remember thinking, great. I know this airplane carries about 300 people. At least it's not 300.
It was about regrets. It was about things I hadn't done in my life. It was about ways I've treated the odd person here or there that I wish I'd treated more gently. It was about how stupid I was at some of the things I used to make big issues out of that are so insignificant when it really comes down to what real reality is about. It was pretty devastating.
And I remember telling a mother with a baby, and I had daughter, Victoria, and telling this woman that it was going to be okay. And I did it. I was so proud of myself that I could be so straight with her and tell her that it was going to be all right and really look at her in the eyes.
Okay, and how far from the field are we now?
You're 35, correction, make that 39 miles from Winnipeg.
Roger.
Now that controllers can see Flight 143 on radar, they can provide Quintel with the information he needs to figure out if he can glide as far as Winnipeg.
Roger, what is your altitude now?
8.5.
8.5.
About 8,500 feet above the ground, Captain Pearson can see his destination. Winnipeg's airport is less than 35 miles away.
We're visual.
But the news from Quintel is not good.
Bob.
Morris was calmly keeping track of our distance by input from Winnipeg Air Traffic Control and our altitude, and calculated our profile and came to the conclusion that we might not make the runway in Winnipeg.
We can last maybe another 20 miles. We're not going to make Winnipeg.
Quintel has calculated that at the rate they're falling, they would hit the ground a full 15 miles short of the runway.
How far are we from Gimli?
You're approximately 12 miles from Gimli right now.
Where is it?
Which way is he moving? On your right. Turn right to a heading of 345.
I would say you have 10 miles to fly.
Okay, fine. We're gonna go there.
I'm gonna go check on my family. You guys don't need me up here right now, huh?
No, we're okay.
Don't worry about it. It's okay. They got it under control. Just make sure your seatbelts are tight, all right?
When I went finally to sit down in my seat, this is where I thought, wow, you know, this is it.
Landing gear down.
Roger.
First Officer Quintel lowers the landing gear. Because there's no hydraulic power, Quintel does what's known as a gravity drop, letting the gear's own weight drop and lock it into place. The two main gear are heavy, they fall immediately, and two green lights confirm they've locked. But the nose gear is lighter, it doesn't lock.
We could hear the main gear clearly, falling and locking. I was not aware that the nose gear was not down and locked.
It was sort of a last minute, and if it's something that you cannot control, you don't talk about it, you don't mention it, you know. The main thing was bring the aircraft on the runway.
5 miles to touchdown.
Roger. We have the field in sight.
5 miles from Gimli, Pearson and Quintel finally see a runway they can land on. But there's a problem.
We're too close, huh? It's going to be too steep, too fast.
Yeah, I know.
Pearson is almost at the runway, but he's much too high above it. If he comes down at a normal descent rate, he'll miss the landing strip. But if he comes down steeply, his plane will gather a dangerous amount of speed. He won't be able to stop before the end of the runway.
The normal approach, we have leading edge and trailing edge flaps, which allow us to slow the airplane down and fly at a slower speed safely. We did not have those flaps as they run off the main hydraulic system.
So what are we gonna do? So we discussed, we had two possibilities. One of them was to do a 360-degree turn and lose the excess of altitude. On the other hand, I thought it would take about 3 minutes, and we were already descending at the rate of 2,500 feet a minute.
Only about 3,000 feet above the ground, the plane doesn't have enough altitude to make a full circle. It would hit the ground before making it back to the landing strip. Pearson chooses a second option.
Well, I guess I'll just slip it.
Pearson decides to try a maneuver called a side slip, practically unheard of on commercial airliners, but sometimes used by glider pilots. And Bob Pearson has a lot of experience flying gliders.
I'm just going to slip it down till we're almost down at the runway, then I'll straighten it out. Okay.
Side-slipping involves what's known as crossing the controls.
Here we go.
Pearson plans to force the aircraft into a sideways freefall, allowing it to drop quickly without increasing its forward airspeed. Pearson has never actually performed a side-slip in a glider, but he's attempting one now in a Boeing 767.
The only way that I could control our speed and our descent profile with the runway was to induce drag in the fuselage by cross-controlling the rudder and the elevators on the tail and the ailerons and the wingtips and cause the aircraft into a crab configuration. Then I could vary that to increase or decrease our speed or increase or decrease our descent rate.
Pearson controls the plane's descent by using his rudders and ailerons to change the angle of the plane. Crossing the controls involves tipping the wings in one direction, but turning the aircraft in the opposite direction, pushing it sideways into the oncoming air. As Flight 143 begins to drop towards the Earth, Quintel is about to discover something he did not expect. The runway he trained at 15 years ago is no longer a runway. Captain Bob Pearson is out of fuel, out of engines, out of options. If he can't line up with the runway at Gimli, he doesn't get a second chance. Pearson turns the yoke left and pushes the rudders to the right. The plane slips to its left.
We're sitting in the center, which is the heart of the airplane where it starts, so it's pretty solid there. I thought there's a real good chance here that we'll be all right. However, when he put the airplane into a side slip, all that went out the window because I figured, oh, if he hits a wing or something, it starts to catapult and roll, that's not going to work anymore.
The 767 loses altitude quickly, plowing sideways through the air.
When I looked to the left of the aircraft, I was looking directly at the ground because the airplane is angled quite, well, about maybe 60 degrees of banks. The bank angle was quite high and the nose of the aircraft was quite high. And it was an awkward moment, and if it was awkward for me, I can imagine for the passengers, it must really have felt odd.
I saw a sand trap from this golf course, and I thought, we're going to crash.
Pearson must maintain a crucial balance. He's got to slow the plane enough to be able to land safely. But if he slows down too much, the airliner could lose its lift and plummet to the ground.
When a pilot is normally landing an airplane, he's maneuvering the flight controls and operating the thrust levers pretty continuously on most landings. And so I was doing the same thing without the thrust levers.
This is where I thought of my daughter, Victoria, being alone with my husband and how he was going to cope with our daughter and how she was going to cope without having a mom.
As they approach, Pearson focuses on his target, the threshold of the runway.
I got tunnel vision like I've never had it before. It was just our speed and our relationship with the threshold of the runway.
But now, only hundreds of feet from the ground, Quintel sees that their troubles are far from over. The Gimli landing strip has been converted into a drag racing strip. Today is Saturday, and it's not just a race day. It's a family day on the Gimli Strip. Racing is done for the day, but the airfield is filled with members of the local sports car club. camping out with their families for the weekend. Two children have decided to pedal the length of the runway. They don't hear the plane coming for them. Without engines, it's silent. And one thing the 767 doesn't have is a horn.
Brace! Brace for landing!
The nose hit with quite a bang on the runway. Sounded like a shotgun going off at our feet.
The front landing gear gives out immediately. Pearson brakes hard. 2 tires blow out. The bottom of the right engine scrapes the runway.
I was a robot. There was just no emotion at all.
Finally, Pearson sees what's in their path.
And I looked up and I could see 2 boys on bicycles. They must have been probably about 1,000 feet down the runway from our position when I saw them.
And then at one point, I can see he raised his head, and he's surprised. Here's this big aircraft.
I can still remember the look of terror on their faces. So they were close enough for me to see that.
With no nose gear to steer with, Pearson's only hope of driving the plane left or right is by varying the brake pressure on the 2 main landing gear.
That's when my heart started to pitter-patter a little bit.
The kids panic and try to outrun a plane that's traveling about 200 miles an hour.
I knew I couldn't take the airplane into these boys, and I was going to take it off into the grass on the right side. There were campers along the west side of the runway that I didn't notice until after we had touched down, and the nose was on the ground, and I can still remember out the left side, people standing by their barbecues.
Dino Calvert is at the track with his friends for a weekend of racing.
One of the gentlemen in the pits suddenly jumped in his car and he took off. And I thought, well, you don't drive like that in the pits usually. And I looked up and all I could see was smoke rising.
Pearson does all he can to stop the plane in time.
Holy crow!
The plane plows into a guardrail installed down the middle of the runway.
Smoke, Bob.
"17 minutes after running out of fuel, Air Canada Flight 143 comes to a final stop on the ground.
Yeah? You okay?
Somebody yelled, "Yahoo!" or something, and then people started applauding. And we were so grateful. We made it. When you believe that you're going to crash, you do believe that the airplane is going to break apart, you're going to have fire.
Evacuate! Evacuate!
Evacuate!
All right, let's go. We gotta get up.
Thick smoke is quickly filling the cabin. The crew doesn't take any chances. They want everyone off the plane as quickly as possible.
There was a sense of joy, and then a panic, kind of. It seemed to go in waves, and then a panic saying, we got to get out of here. We got to get out of here.
Less than 2 months earlier, an Air Canada DC-9 made a successful emergency landing in Cincinnati, only to burst into flames on the tarmac before all the passengers could get off. 23 people died. The crew and passengers of this flight want to avoid a similar fate.
It took maybe just a few seconds to come up to a full halt on the runway, but the cockpit was full of smoke.
Passenger evacuation checklist.
Passenger checklist.
Fuel shut off. Off. Cabin depressurized. Electrics off. Electrics off. Checklist complete. Time to get out of here.
Come on, guys, get some fire extinguishers. We grabbed the fire extinguishers on our way, and you never go to a fire at a racetrack without having a fire extinguisher with you. And we ran up towards it. The doors open up, and you see the chutes come out, sort of like a spider growing legs.
The plane ended up eventually standing almost what appeared to me to be almost on its nose.
When I opened my door and I saw that the chute was so steep, I thought, oh my goodness, how do I get these passengers to go down?
Due to the nose-down angle of the plane, the 2 rear slides don't reach the ground. 10 people are slightly injured during the evacuation, most of them coming down the steep rear slides.
I heard on the west radar frequency, he said, one of the 767 says, he's down okay, he's in one piece, and that's when our cheer went up. I said, okay, because all of these people were going to sleep in their own bed that night.
There's still a lot of smoke coming from the plane's nose.
Turned out it was about 6 inches of insulation between the inner and outer skins. From friction, that was starting to burn.
The flight attendants have good news. All 61 passengers have made it off the plane. There's not so much as a single serious injury.
We'll give you a hand.
Yeah, extinguisher.
Bob Pearson has done what no one has done before. He's safely landed a 767 with no engines, gliding to safety for more than 26,000 feet.
Air Canada Flight 143 glided...
The event makes international headlines immediately. People are already asking how one of the most sophisticated passenger planes in the world could have run out of fuel.
Sliding down emergency chutes.
By the next day, the investigation has already begun. Bill Taylor and Diane Rochelot of Canada's Aviation Safety Bureau are among the first investigators at the scene.
I was a junior mechanical engineering at the time. I had been working for Transport Canada for a year. Going to the field for the first time was very exciting. It was new. It was a major aircraft.
Once we got into the fuel quantity indicating system, I actually left Diane to deal with the specifics of the computer system.
First, Bill Taylor needs to confirm what everyone has been telling him, that the plane is out of fuel. Investigators drained the tanks, collecting less than 17 gallons of fuel. The 767 can hold almost 24,000 gallons. It's like having 5 tablespoons of fuel in a mid-sized car. Taylor next needs to examine the possibility that the fuel leaked out during the flight.
The other checks involve looking for any evidence of fuel having been lost. They even went so far as to go into what they call the dry bay of the aircraft. I'm a bit claustrophobic, so I really wasn't too enthused about going up in there, but I crawled up and had a look around with the flashlight and confirmed that there was no evidence of fuel having been lost in there.
That leaves Taylor with only one conclusion. Flight 143 took off without enough fuel. Now investigators need to find out why.
It's in one piece.
Diane Rochelot begins looking for the answer to that question in the plane's sophisticated electronics bay, located beneath the cabin.
The 767 was a newer type aircraft, and it did have a lot of computerized system, and I guess back in 1982, these were coming onto the market at a fast rate, and they were newer types of electronic system.
Rochelot confirms that a computerized unit, the digital fuel gauge processor, had been malfunctioning on this plane. There was no spare in Montreal, so it couldn't be replaced. Rochelot takes the component for testing.
It was decided early on that the unit, the fuel processing unit, would be taken to the manufacturer, Honeywell, in Indianapolis for testing. And I was tasked with taking the unit. So we went through all the testing procedure, and then at one point we did discover that there was a malfunction with the unit. During the testing, we went more and more in depth, and we found out that one of the circuit, it's called an inductor coil. It was a very, very small part, and it was encapsulated at manufacture, and encapsulated means it's covered with plastic. You cannot visually see it because it's now covered with plastic, and you can't see the inductor coil itself. But once we took over the plastic case, we could see that the solder joint had not been made properly, which caused a malfunction in the system.
The faulty processor explains why Pearson didn't have fuel gauges for the flight, but doesn't explain why he didn't have enough fuel. The inoperative gauges were clearly flagged. Ground crews wouldn't have relied on them when they were fueling the plane. Investigators confirmed that the ground crew did perform a manual check of the fuel before takeoff.
We just need to know what you did next.
Yeah? We did a manual check of both tanks, and then we pump enough fuel for the trip to Edmonton.
Flight 143 should have taken off with enough fuel for the trip.
Okay, thanks.
That helps.
Investigators now have to figure out how one of the world's most advanced jetliners took off with half the fuel necessary for its flight. The investigators know that with its fuel gauges out of service, Flight 143's fuel tanks were checked manually. Then the fuel for the trip to Edmonton was added to the tanks. But before the plane could be given more fuel, a crucial calculation had to be carried out. Pilots need to know the weight of the fuel on their plane. But fuel trucks pump jet fuel by volume. In order for pilots and fuelers to communicate, a simple routine translation between volume and weight has to be made.
Thank you.
Investigators check and double-check that math. The fueling records from the day of the accident provide the answers they've been looking for.
This is a typical fueling record.
But when investigators examine the calculations for Flight 143...
And this is from Flight 143.
They look anything but straightforward. The document clearly shows the amount of fuel in the right and left tanks, but investigators are troubled by two particular numbers. One converts volume to kilograms. The other converts it to pounds.
He shouldn't have been using both. So did you convert to pounds or to kilograms?
To pound? Oh, to kilo. Can I see that again?
Further interviews with the technicians and crew reveal that the events on Flight 143
now I don't know what I did.
Were caused by human error involving poor calculations and ultimately inadequate training.
Okay, fellas, we've finished with the fuel.
The technicians refueling Flight 143 got muddled in their calculations while converting the volume coming out of the fuel truck to the weight of the fuel in the plane's tanks. No one who saw the calculations that day noticed the basic error. In 1983, Canadian ground crews were used to converting the amount of fuel leaving their trucks into pounds. The 767 was the first plane in Air Canada's fleet to have metric fuel gauges. Its fuel should have been measured not in pounds, but in kilograms, which requires a different calculation. Flight 143 needed 22,300 kilograms of fuel for the trip. But pilots and technicians let it leave with 22,300 pounds instead. Because a pound is about half a kilogram, the plane only got half the fuel it required, which explains why Pearson's flight computer told him he had plenty of fuel. He entered the wrong amount of fuel to start with. In the past, the flight engineer calculated the fuel loads. This accident raised an important question. Whose job was it with the two-man crew?
Better training is definitely an issue in an incident such as that. If everyone is trained and the lines are drawn as to who's responsible for what, then there's no ambiguity on it. People know what they're responsible for. In this case, it was sort of open-ended. We weren't aware who was responsible for the final say on this field stuff.
A subsequent inquiry found that none of those involved that day was trained in metric calculations. Not the ground technicians, not the pilots.
I had not received any, neither of us had received any training at all on doing these calculations.
The computer that had replaced the 767's flight engineer was broken, and no one knew who should be doing its job. Air Canada 143 was essentially down a man.
And the goal is to prevent a recurrence of this particular event. And also, we also find out other systems that might have been either at fault or maybe they could cause a problem in the future, and you do try to prevent recurrence.
All right.
It took a string of mechanical and human failures for Flight 143 to run out of fuel. But another failure that day may have saved some lives. If the plane's nose gear had not collapsed, it would have taken Pearson much longer to stop. The plane could have slid into the people who were at the strip that day, which would have had catastrophic results. There could have been more injuries or even loss of life. Pearson and Quintel were partly blamed for their roles in the incident. A government inquiry recommended that Air Canada re-evaluate the training of flight crews and ground technicians in metric fuel conversions. It also recommended that the airline keep more spare parts, such as fuel gauge processors. Rick Dion retired in 2003 after a long career as Air Canada's coordinator of maintenance control. First Officer Maurice Quintel was promoted to captain in 1989. Captain Bob Pearson went on to fly 10 more years for Air Canada, his experience at Gimli shaping the rest of his career as a commercial pilot.
This experience affected me mostly by making me more relaxed as a pilot, giving me the feeling that as much as I've trained for all those years, that there's always that question about how you're going to perform when the chips are down, and I now have the feeling that no matter what, as long as an aircraft stayed together, I would get it safely back on the ground. And so it's been a relaxing experience.
It's the knowledge that you know under stress you can perform. Before that, you don't know. You just hope you will, and you train for it, but you never know.
With the things that they had to deal with was magnificent. I think that got proven in the simulator in Vancouver. They tried out this same circumstances with several crews, and they all crashed.
Probably the most important thing that came out of it was a realization that when something new is introduced, special attention and training needs to be accomplished for people to be aware what they're dealing with.
When we had landed and the airplane was all in one piece, I thought, wow, I got another chance to fly again.
Because of a tragedy like that, once you take your deck of cards and fire it in the air, you're truly free. And I guess from that point of view, Gimli could, I find it very difficult to say, but Gimli was maybe almost the best thing that ever happened to me, next to meeting my wonderful wife and marrying her.
2 days after the landing at Gimli, Air Canada's 767 was back in the air on its way to Winnipeg for repairs. A quarter century later, that same plane is still in service, and it still carries the nickname that Bob Pearson earned it, the Gimli Glider. At the time, it was the worst crash in aviation history.
It was just a scene of absolute, utter devastation.
In 1974, more than 300 people died when their plane fell from the sky.
There's barely anything left here that's recognizable as being a part of an aircraft.
You couldn't walk anywhere without the danger you were going to stand on a part of a human being.
The key to understanding the disaster is found thousands of kilometers away. An unusual piece of evidence that tells the troubling story of a crash that could have been prevented.
Mayday, Mayday.
June the 12th, 1972. One of the newest members of American Airlines Fleet is in Detroit, Michigan.
John, Page.
Flight 96, a brand new DC-10, is getting ready for takeoff. Captain Bryce McCormick and co-pilot Paige Whitney have been in the plane for hours.
Back there, so when we're in flight, if you can get a chance just to look at that.
Detroit is just a stopover on a flight from LA to Buffalo and then to New York.
You got there? You ready to try one, Page?
All right, sir.
McCormick has flown the plane out from California, but Whitney is going to fly the next leg. Both men want as much time at the controls as possible. Neither one of them has more than 75 hours flying the DC-10. Few pilots have more. There simply aren't enough of the planes in the air. In 1972, the DC-10 had just been introduced. The plane is the latest advance to passenger jets. Its style and its size set it apart from other airliners. The McDonnell Douglas Corporation has spent more than $1 billion developing it.
In the late 60s, there was a race going among the three major manufacturers of jetliners, McDonnell Douglas, Boeing, and Lockheed, to see who could get the first jumbo out. So they got really busy on getting this DC-10 into production as fast as they could. And one of the things that they could not suffer were many delays based on some problem with the design.
American Airlines is one of the first companies to buy the plane. Flight 96 is one of those planes. Just the 5th DC-10 ever built. Cydia Smith has just been trained to be the chief flight attendant on the DC-10.
I was excited because it was one of the first jumbos that we had. And I was going to have the opportunity to fly number 1, which is what I always wanted to do on a big jet.
Okay, you got it? Hand on the wheel. I got you. V1, rotate.
Just after 7 in the evening, Flight 96 lifts off from Detroit Airport. Just minutes after takeoff, the plane is rising easily through 3,500 meters over Windsor, Ontario, Canada.
I was sitting in my seat, and the captain had turned off the fasten seatbelt sign, and I was making my way to the galley, and I had to go sort of downhill because we were climbing to go to the galley to turn on the coffee. when I punched the coffee and I moved over to one side, that's when it happened. I remember falling over because the plane was like this, but all of a sudden it just went like this. I saw ceiling compartments fall, and I saw things coming out of pockets and everything, and I thought to myself, oh boy. It felt like the last day of my life.
We hit something! We lost an engine here!
In the cockpit, the crew is fighting for control of their jet. The throttles which control the 3 engines have snapped to idle. The plane loses almost all its thrust. The huge jet begins slowing down.
The plane immediately took a huge drop. And the next thing that happened was I was hit in the face with a piece of the plane. My husband was frantically trying to find a stewardess to give me something to put a pressure on my face to stop the bleeding.
Let me have it!
McCormick takes over control of the plane. He and Whitney wrestle the jet level. But Flight 96 has been badly damaged.
Have we got hydraulics? No, I've got full rudder here.
The rudder on the tail, which controls the direction of the jet, is jammed to the right. That's forcing the plane to swing dramatically in that direction. While McCormick fights to turn his damaged plane back to Detroit, Cydia Smith is shocked to see a gaping hole in the floor of the main passenger cabin.
People were asking me, what to do, and I knew that I didn't know what to tell them.
Smith has been able to account for all of her passengers. But flight attendant Sandra McConnell is missing.
Sandra! Can you hear me? Sandra, where are you?
And finally, I saw her come out of one of the bathrooms.
McConnell has to cross the hole in the floor to move to safety.
And almost every step she took, the floor kept collapsing.
The crew brings up power to the engines on the wings. But the third engine on the tail stubbornly refuses to respond.
Center, this is American Airlines Flight 96. We got an emergency.
American 96, roger. Type of emergency?
We've got a jammed rudder. We need to get down and make an approach.
Along with his engine and his rudder, McCormick is also having trouble controlling the elevators on the tail of the plane. They help him move the massive plane up and down. They're slow to respond, but he can move them. The situation isn't completely hopeless.
I think it's going to fly!
American 96, turn further right, heading 200.
Without complete control of the elevators, and with a rudder that's frozen to the right, McCormick has to use his engines to turn the plane. By increasing the thrust on one side of the plane, he can change direction. But it won't be fast.
I have no rudder control whatsoever. So our turns are going to have to be very slow and cautious.
All of the passengers move as far away from the hole in the back as possible. But apart from the cut to Loretta Kaminsky, so far there are no other serious injuries.
Captain, there's a hole in the back of the plane. A hole? Yes, sir. What do you want us to do? Get everyone ready for an emergency emergency landing.
Bryce McCormick's DC-10 is badly damaged. The lives of everyone on board now depend entirely on his ability to land a plane that can barely fly. With explosive suddenness, a short flight from Detroit to Buffalo has become the most challenging flight of Captain Bryce McCormick's career. He's down an engine, and he can't move his rudder. As he heads back to Detroit, McCormick begins to slow his plane down so it can land safely. But when he does, his plane begins falling dangerously fast. Ideally, McCormick should be descending at 700 feet a minute. But now he's falling more than twice that fast. 1,600 feet per minute.
What's the sink rate? Sink rate, 1,600!
At this rate, McCormick will crash well short of the runway. He increases power to his engines to slow his fall.
Sink rate, 700.
McCormick has slowed the plane's descent to 700 feet per minute. But to do that, he's had to increase his forward airspeed, which means he'll be landing far faster than usual. For the first time since the beginning of the crisis, McCormick talks to the passengers.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking.
We've had a small problem, but the plane is under control now, and we're heading back to Detroit for an emergency landing.
Bryce McCormick was as calm as if he were welcoming you on the plane.
As the plane nears the airport, flight attendants ask passengers to remove their shoes and any sharp pieces of jewelry.
They had to take off their shoes and glasses. We collected everything in a blanket.
Less than half an hour after leaving, the badly damaged DC-10 struggles back to the Detroit airport.
The few minutes that it took to get back to Detroit were the longest minutes that I will ever remember spending on an airplane, because we were sure that we were not going to survive.
Captain Bryce McCormick now needs to give the jet even more power to push the nose up for landing. His plane is still drifting to the right and traveling fast.
I have no rudder to straighten it out when it hits.
The DC-10 with 67 people aboard roars toward the runway at almost 300 kilometers an hour.
The landing was the most frightening part of the entire flight.
When the plane hits the ground, it begins veering hard to the right.
Once the plane landed, it seemed like we just went on forever. I mean, it was just forever.
One set of landing gear wheels runs off the runway and through the grass. After a harrowing touchdown, the plane eventually comes to a stop just 300 meters from the end of the runway.
Okay. Engines off at your discretion. Shut him down.
Every woman wanted to hug him, and he was just amazing, because it was just at that moment that we all realized that we were alive because of him, that he literally had saved our lives.
If you take a look at something like this and you say, well, there's good flying and there's bad flying, this is beyond good. This is superlative. This is using every instinct you have as an airman and all the capabilities you have to stay calm enough to get the situation assessed.
With the plane on the ground, the crew has its first opportunity to inspect the damage.
The captain and I walked back when everybody was off. We walked back to the back, and we just looked up and saw this hole. And it was just so weird.
There's no indication that the jet hit something as the pilots first thought. What has caused such damage to the airliner?
The hole was so enormous that if anyone had been sitting in the seats that were there, they would have been sucked out immediately. At that point, they still felt it might have been a bomb.
But while the incident had happened with explosive suddenness, no indication of a bomb is found. As investigators begin their work, they discover that not all of the DC-10 is at the Detroit airport. A coffin that the plane was carrying in its cargo hold is discovered 30 kilometers away from the Detroit airport, near Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Investigators also find the plane's rear cargo door.
Doors are not supposed to fall off airplanes, especially since it was a rather new airplane. You would not expect something like that to happen.
When they examine the cargo area of the plane, they discover that the very design of the door makes it a potential weak spot. Most doors on a jet open inward. In fact, the door is slightly larger than the frame it fits into. As the pressure builds inside a jet, this type of plug door is actually forced into the frame of the aircraft. The design makes the door extremely safe. But McDonnell Douglas designed the cargo door on the DC-10 to open outward. That decision was made to increase the amount of storage space on the plane. When it's closed, hooks on the DC-10's door grab hold of a bar on the plane's doorframe. To make sure it's closed, baggage handlers push down on a lever, which drives locking pins through the hooks, which hold them in place. When investigators examine the cargo area of the plane, they don't find any structural damage around the door. When they study the locks on the cargo door itself, they find that the latches are not completely closed. And the pins that are supposed to make sure the door is locked are not in their locked position.
When we interrogated the cargo handler that closed the door, it became immediately apparent that he used excessive force to close the door. And in fact, he said he had to use his knee to get the door handle to go flush.
Investigators make a frightening discovery. It's possible to close the lever on the outside of the door, even if the hooks and locking pins are not in the closed position. Paul Eddy is a journalist who investigated the history of the DC-10.
What Windsor showed is that you could actually pull the handle in order to buckle the top fixture so that the handle went home properly, but the locking pins had not gone through the spools.
Engage the lever. This means that baggage handlers can believe the door is closed when it's not. Not only can the outside lever be closed without the locks being fully engaged, there's no way for the crew of the plane to know. The faulty locking pins will still turn off the warning light, even though they aren't in their proper position. The door was a ticking time bomb. As passenger jets climb, the difference between the pressure inside the plane and the pressure outside the plane grows. If a door isn't properly shut, it will blow out with explosive force. The problem on the American Airlines flight began as the plane passed through 3,500 meters. When the door blew, the coffin in the cargo hold was sucked out. When the air pressure inside the plane was released, anything that wasn't firmly attached was pulled out of the airliner.
It's a really startling thing if you're not expecting it. What you've got is a lot of air stuffed inside this pressure vessel that now wants to get out. And the bigger the airplane is, the more powerful the hurricane of air leaving the airplane is during that period of time.
By itself, explosive decompression does not make a plane unflyable. So why had Captain McCormick experienced such difficulties controlling his jet? Investigators take a closer look at the back of the plane's cabin and learn that the very design of the DC-10 makes it vulnerable. When the cargo door blew off, there was so much pressure on the floor of the cabin that it collapsed into the cargo compartment below. When it did, the floor ripped into some of the plane's critical control systems.
When it collapsed the floor, it took the cables that controlled number 2 engine, and it took most of the cables, or impeded most of the cables that had to do with the flight controls in the back.
I think it's going to fly!
It left McCormick just enough control to keep his plane level. The remarkable flying of Bryce McCormick had saved the lives of everyone on board Flight 96. But there was a problem with one of the newest and most expensive planes flying over North America.
In the Windsor incident, there was an obvious flaw. And that's where the NTSB said, look, here is really the smoking gun, the ability to close that thing without having all those locks engaged. Let's make sure we change this system right now. Every DC-10 operator needs to know this.
I want everything checked. I want all the bolts checked first.
Chuck Miller is the head of the NTSB's Aviation Safety Bureau.
You have to check all the latches, okay? Every single latch.
It's his responsibility to point out problems with the new DC-10 and propose solutions. He helps write the fixes he thinks McDonnell Douglas needs to make to keep the plane safe.
He was a very, very professional man, and he had his investigators had enormous respect for him. Chuck didn't sit back in the office. Chuck was always on the scene.
For Chuck Miller, fixing the DC-10 is a matter of professional pride. For McDonnell Douglas, the near accident over Windsor has enormous implications. Their billion-dollar gamble came close to tumbling from the sky. If anything else goes wrong, the company itself could be at stake. March the 3rd, 1974. A perfect spring-like day in Paris. It's been almost 2 years since a DC-10 came close to crashing near Windsor, Ontario. Now more than 50 of the new planes are flying around the world. One of them, Plane 29, is owned by Turkish Airlines. Normally, the last leg of this trip from Turkey to England wouldn't be very crowded. But today, the DC-10 is filling up fast. People are squeezing into seats throughout the plane. A strike at a British airline has passengers scrambling for any flight back to London. Wendy Wheel is one of many last-minute additions to the flight. A model, she's returning home after a shoot in Spain.
We'd been married for 18 months, and we were about to start a family. I believe the secret of her success for modeling was not just that she was a very attractive girl, and good model material, but she was generally liked by all the photographers because she had such a pleasing, lovely, light personality.
With all the new passengers boarding, the flight is a little behind schedule. And it's not only the crew who are waiting. At the back of the plane is baggage handler Mohammed Mahmoudi. With all the new passengers, he's not sure if there are any more bags to load.
C'est tout. Vous êtes fini. Bien, j'ai l'affaire.
Not expecting any other luggage, Mahmoudi locks the rear cargo door. The DC-10 is set to go. Just after 12:30 in the afternoon, THY Flight 981 lifts off into the skies above Paris. London is less than an hour away.
Brace control, this is Tango Hotel Yankee 981. We're at 60. Requesting clearance to flight level 230.
Tango Hotel Yankee 981, you are cleared to flight level 230.
981, roger.
As it flies away from the airport, the DC-10 continues to gain altitude. 2,700 meters, 3,000 meters, 3,300 meters. The huge jet shudders and banks to the left.
The cabin blew out! Are you sure?
Just 16 seconds after the start of the crisis, the crew struggles to save their crippled jet. The nose is pitching down, the plane picking up speed.
Bring it up! I can't bring it up! She doesn't respond!
Passengers at the back of the plane witness a horrifying scene. 2 rows of seats have simply disappeared. Through a huge hole in the floor, passengers can see the sky over France.
7,000 feet! Hydraulics! We've lost it!
The crew discovers that they have no hydraulic power with which to control the plane. Without it, they can't move their rudder or elevators. Even without its most basic controls, the plane begins to level out. But it's fallen too far.
Looks like we're going to hit the ground! Speed!
The DC-10 is traveling almost 800 kilometers an hour. The flight from Paris to London never even makes it to the English Channel. Just 9 minutes after taking off, Turkish Airways Flight 981 becomes the worst plane crash of all time. In London, the flight is listed as delayed. The news of the crash comes out slowly.
I went to the ticket office kiosk and I asked what has happened to the flight, and instantly the look on the gentleman's face behind the counter told me something was wrong, instantly.
There's barely anything left here that's recognizable as being a part of an aircraft.
I looked on the television and I just thought, well, I just hope she's dead, because I just saw the carnage of the forest in Senlis, and it was like looking at a First World War trench movie.
Flight 981, carrying 346 passengers, virtually disintegrates on impact. There are no survivors.
It was just a scene of absolute, utter devastation. And the litter of personal possessions, electric wires, bits of metal, bits of bodies, just strewn everywhere. I mean, you couldn't walk anywhere without the danger you were going to stand on a part of a human being. I still have nightmares about this, even though it's 33 years ago.
Investigators for the French Accident Investigation Bureau are quickly on the scene.
My first job was to evaluate the scope of the wreckage and to begin the first investigation on the spot. At first, I was unable to know what has happened. I was just seeing that a terrible crash has occurred and that it will be a very hard work for the investigators.
Despite the enormous force of the crash, the black boxes, made of 3 layers of hardened steel and insulation, survive. Their contents could provide valuable clues about the crash.
Most of the speculation was that it must have been a bomb, because, you know, you've got a almost brand new, very powerful aeroplane flying in clear blue sky, and it gets to 12,000 feet and falls out of it.
Investigators are called to a field 15 kilometers from the crash site. They find a piece of fuselage and 2 rows of seats from the DC-10. Somehow, they fell free of the airliner before the rest of the plane smashed into the forest. When investigators arrive, the bodies of the passengers who were in the seats have already been removed. When relatives of those who died in the crash arrive in France, they're directed to a small church in the town of Senlis.
One of the saddest sights I've ever seen is in this church. They laid out on tables everything they'd found, you know, clothing, possessions, teddy bears, rings, watches. And then relatives who wanted to were allowed to come and walk around these trestle tables with all this stuff laid out.
They produced a little packet with my wife's wedding ring and rings, engagement ring. It was all pretty battered up, so you could imagine the thoughts that went through my mind.
Since the accident involves an American plane, the NTSB's Chuck Miller joins the investigation. For the second time in 2 years, he's dealing with a problem with the DC-10.
I don't believe that Miller suspected for one moment that the door hadn't been fixed after Windsor.
But it becomes clear that the piece of fuselage found in France is in fact the plane's rear cargo door. It seems like a repeat of the Windsor accident. Miller is left with a haunting question. Why hadn't the problem been fixed?
When he saw the door, of course, saw that it hadn't been done. The fix hadn't been made. And that's when I think his anger became very, very strong indeed.
Miller takes an unusual step. Although the official investigation is just beginning, he gives journalist Paul Eddy an important tip.
I said, have you got any ideas what made the door come off? He said, yeah. If I were you, I'd go and look at a place called Windsor, Ontario.
Hello. I'm Chuck Miller.
Miller shares his suspicions with the French investigators.
Could you please pass these around? These were taken on June 12th, 1972, right after the incident.
We have asked for the report on the Windsor accident, and our American colleagues were also volunteers to give us a lot of details.
Now, we had an American Airlines flight from Detroit to Buffalo have its cargo door blow off.
And he has been very frank and had explained what he was thinking of the Windsor accident.
After all the work done during the American Airlines investigation, had something been overlooked? Was there another problem with McDonnell Douglas's enormous plane? With the information from Chuck Miller, French investigators take a closer look at the plane's cargo door. They make a shocking discovery. There is no new problem. It's just like the American Airlines case all over again. The latches that are supposed to hold the cargo door closed aren't locked. And since 2 rows of seats were sucked out of the DC-10 over Paris, it's clear that the floor on the plane collapsed, just as it had in Windsor.
It looks like we're going to hit the ground!
In fact, when investigators listen to the cockpit voice recorder, they find that the Turkish flight crew had even less control of their plane than the crew of American Airlines Flight 96.
We need to get down and make an approach. I think it's going to fly!
Over Windsor, Bryce McCormick was able to recover his plane and land it. But in Paris, all the hydraulic systems were destroyed.
We've lost it!
The hydraulic fluid helps crews move the rudder and elevators on the tail. Not being able to control them meant the crew couldn't keep their plane in the sky.
The basic problem was the Paris flight was much heavier in terms of the number of people on board. The floor, when it collapsed with such a tremendous amount of pressure that it literally severed all the cables and control to the back. They had no hope after that point.
You and each of you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about...
Shortly after the crash of Turkish Airlines Flight 981, Chuck Miller is back in the United States.
Our first witness this morning is Mr. C.O. Miller, Director of the Bureau of Aviation Safety of the NTSB.
This time, he's facing questions from American senators.
A potentially catastrophic design defect.
A special hearing begins to find out how a problem that was identified in 1972 could bring another plane down 2 years later.
Of course, our understanding up to this time, they all had been.
What you've got to now discover is why wasn't that door fixed? Why would a major, venerable, mighty American corporation deliberately do something like this?
Less than a month after the near crash over Windsor, the NTSB had made 2 very specific recommendations. Miller and his investigators recommended that a change be made to the locking mechanism.
Engage the lever.
They wanted to make sure that it was physically impossible for baggage handlers to close the lever without the locking pins being in place. They also suggested that vents be put into the floors of all DC-10s. This would rapidly allow the pressurized cabin air to equalize without collapsing the floor. But in the 2 years since the accident, neither one of these recommendations was implemented.
There is a fundamental problem at the heart of aviation safety, and has been in the United States for a very long time, and that is that it's the job of the NTSB to discover what's happened and to come up with recommendations as to how to prevent it happening again, but it has absolutely no authority to implement them.
The NTSB does not have regulatory authority. They have to turn to the FAA, as they did, and say, we want these things done. And that's where the system went wrong.
If the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, issues an airworthiness directive, planes are pulled out of service until the proper fix is made. But as serious as the problems on the DC-10 were, no airworthiness directive was ever issued. A so-called gentleman's agreement between the head of the FAA and the head of McDonnell Douglas stopped it from happening.
The gentleman's agreement is the root cause of Paris. There is no question that if an airworthiness directive had been issued, as it should have been after Windsor, Paris would not have happened. It was an entirely avoidable accident.
McDonnell Douglas assured the FAA that it would fix the problem voluntarily. An airworthiness directive would cast a shadow on the still fledgling DC-10.
The last thing in the world you want is for the public or any of the airlines who are going to be operating these airplanes to think, oh, maybe there's some flaws in this bird. And so an airworthiness directive, especially one that requires you to go back and re-engineer something, is a really horrific thought for a manufacturer.
McDonnell Douglas did make changes to the way the cargo door was built. A peephole was cut in the bottom of the door so baggage handlers could see if the locking pins had engaged. Several warning signs were also attached to the plane's door. The company also made other changes to the DC-10. These included increasing the length of the locking pins and attaching a plate to the inside of the door. This plate would make it physically impossible to push down the lever if the door wasn't properly locked. But each of the proposed fixes had its own problem. Many baggage handlers didn't know what the small window in the door was for. And the baggage handler in Paris read and spoke 3 languages, but not English, the only language in which the warning signs were written. The support plate that was supposed to be installed in the door was never attached to the jet that crashed in Paris. Papers confirming the completion of the work are also uncovered. But no matter what the paper trail says, the fix was never made.
Again, the problem is you don't have an independent FAA inspector coming along to look and see it and then put his stamp on it, because it wasn't an airworthiness directive.
In the years following the Turkish Airlines crash, an enormous flurry of lawsuits are filed in California. The tragic story of the DC-10 has one more surprise in store. It's 1974, and an unprecedented series of lawsuits are being filed against McDonnell Douglas. The families of those who died near Paris want someone held responsible.
As time went by, I learned more and more about what actually happened and realized that it was not an accident as we would call an accident. It was totally avoidable. My goal was to expose these people.
In the weeks leading up to the trial, lawyers who are involved in the case have access to the entire history of the DC-10's development. They're not the only ones who pore through the evidence. So does journalist Paul Eddy.
We were determined to get to those documents and that testimony. Somebody gave us a key to the depository where the documents were, and so at night we would go in and then had a huge accumulated pile of documents to go through in order to find out what they've been up to.
Reading through the immense pile of paper, Eddy makes an incredible discovery. A memo written by Don Applegate the director of product engineering for Convair, the company who'd built the cargo door for McDonnell Douglas.
I think the point when we knew we got them was the Applegate memorandum that specifically pre-warned this would happen.
The memo is a damning indictment of the cargo doors that were being made for the DC-10 and the lack of venting in the cabin floors. It warns that it's only a matter of time before there's a major disaster involving the doors.
The airplane demonstrated an inherent susceptibility to catastrophic failure when exposed to explosive decompression of the cargo compartment.
The memo, written just weeks after the near disaster in Windsor, recommends that immediate changes be made to the DC-10 cargo door.
You know you've got them. You know you've got them because you know they knew.
During the court case, another chilling find is made. Not only did McDonnell Douglas know about the problem after Windsor, they knew during the development of the DC-10. 4 years before the Paris crash, 2 years before Windsor, the cargo door failed during a pressure test. The company knew there was a problem, but the fundamental design of the door stayed the same.
I could not believe a large corporation, McDonnell Douglas at the time, could do such a thing, could risk our lives, ordinary people's lives, for the sake of money.
Well, in aviation, it's called tombstone technology. In other words, we always have the balance of money. And unfortunately, over the years, it has been true more times than not that we have had to wait until we had enough people die in an accident to say, you know, we really are going to have to spend the money over here.
The Applegate memo and other information that comes out during the court case leads to one of the biggest settlements in the history of aviation. McDonnell Douglas paid over $80 million in damages. After the Paris crash, foolproof changes were finally made to the DC-10 cargo door. And this time, nothing was left to chance. The FAA issued an airworthiness directive that ensured the doors would never again open in mid-air. And it worked. After Paris, there wasn't another serious incident involving the cargo doors on a DC-10. But the plane's history and an intensely competitive industry did have an impact. McDonnell Douglas sold far fewer commercial DC-10s than it had once hoped for.
Most of the pilots that I know who have flown the DC-10 over the years really love the old bird. She's probably a little more clunky than the 747 in terms of her heaviness of flight controls, but it's still a lovely bird to fly.
That's fine, but you can't disassociate either the airplane or the company from the awful reputation that the crash left.
Eventually, McDonnell Douglas itself disappears. The company was bought by Boeing in 1996. In the forest outside Paris, a monument now stands honoring those who were killed on Flight 981. A permanent reminder of one of the most disturbing crashes in the history of aviation.
You never forget. And I've gone on to lead my life for 30-odd years, but I've never forgotten. People to this day think it was an accident, and it wasn't.